Welcome to this Vital Health podcast from the ISPOR conference in Glasgow, Scotland. I'm Duane Schulthess, the CEO of Vital Transformation. Today we are asking the question, why do we need accelerated access for cancer medicines? And I'm joined by a panel of fantastic experts. Just here to my right is Martina Garau, the Director of the Office of Health Economics, who's been authoring a study on the APACE framework. Hello.
Hello.
Also to my right is Bettina Ryll, founder of the Melanoma Patient Network Europe. Bettina, it's always nice to see you, my friend. How are you?
Delighted to be here. Thank you.
Great to see you. As well, I'm also joined by Kathleen Grieve, MSD's Director of European Public Policy. Kathleen, always lovely to see you. How are you?
Lovely to see you too. I'm well, thank you.
Thank you very much. So ladies, thank you for joining me today. I'm going to start with you, Martina. You are the author of the study APACE. This is the framework Achieving Accelerated Patient Access to Cancer Care in Europe. Can you explain to me what the APACE framework is and what it hopes to accomplish?
Yeah, the framework is aimed to improve and accelerate access to promising oncology treatments in Europe, and is based on a structured process that we had with multiple stakeholders. And the idea is to focus on oncology treatments that addresses an unmet need, aimed at complementing the existing regulatory accelerated pathways that already exist. So in a way, what we observe is that the regulatory have introduced a series of pathways and status to accelerate access, but this is not necessarily matched by HTA and price and reimbursement systems. So in a way, we see some that have introduced pathways, but this is very fragmented, and that leads to disparities in access, and that's where the framework is coming in. It builds into 4 phases, starting from eligibility phase, which is very important because it looks into which treatments deserves and should get an accelerated pathways, because not all of them can go through such a scheme, and then it gets into an initial assessment to evaluate clinical and economic value at that stage, and based on the evidence that is available at that stage. And then following a temporary reimbursement phase, it goes through reassessment so that new evidence can feed into a value assessment, and a final decisions that determines the exit phase and the last phase. So transitioning out of the pathway and deciding whether a treatment should go through normal and standard reimbursement system or being delisted.
Now, you brought up a very important point in your introduction. Aside from the overall framework, it's this dispersion we have between a European regulatory decision and then the 27 member states achieving alignment. I think that's a really important point. How does APACE plan to deal with that alignment? You mentioned it does so. Can you give me some tangible examples as to how it will align those reimbursement and effectiveness decisions that are occurring in the 27 member states?
Sure. Obviously, we are seeing this trend already with the HTA regulation, that it's already started. So there is a convergence in that respect, but we need to accept that the price and reimbursement decisions will remain national responsibilities. And so what we have done is thinking about some general principles, some key principles that need to be considered when you set up those pathways, because otherwise every country will have a different, slightly different system, and or no system at all.
Kind of like we see right now in several states.
Exactly. And so that's the key. So it's shared principles, but then local implementations, local adaptation.
So Bettina, you're one of the thought leaders from patient access and patient evaluation here in Europe. You've been at the forefront for cancer and oncology for nearly a decade, if not more. You've been involved in the Patient Advisory Committee for the APACE framework. What do you see as, from your perspective, as important around the framework? What do you hope to achieve?
So maybe just like a step back for a little bit of context, because I think the reason is always, why are we doing this in the first place? So why is this so critically important? So I founded the Melanoma Patient Network Europe after losing my husband to melanoma, just at the very early stages of the new therapies that came through for melanoma. And at the time, survival at 5 years was below 5%, and now thanks to new therapies, we are above 50%. So melanoma is a classic case for what new innovative, effective drugs can do for patients. So I think we're a bit like a sentinel patient community for that. Accessing these drugs in that period of time, like the first part of that decade you just mentioned, was really, really complex and complicated, and the inequalities in Europe were heartbreaking. It was a few kilometers eastwards or westwards or south that made the difference between having a chance to survive and dying for sure. And as a European citizen, I don't find that acceptable. And that has been kind of the underlying motivation why I've been involved in these access discussions for such a long time. That was also my motivation to take part in this framework, because I do believe that it's time for Europe to sort out its act. You have already mentioned we have achieved regulatory alignment, and I'm sure before we had the EMA, the discussions we've been having were very, very similar to what we now do about HTA. But I frankly don't think it makes sense that we have 27 member states, more than 27 HTA mechanisms, and we are hurting ourselves because everyone then becomes a tiny market trying to be smart, outsmart the others left and right. And I've just been in a session on pricing policy in the current global context here at ISPOR. I think the time for framework and alignment was never more urgent and more timely than it is right now. And that is, of course, also the motivation why I'm here.
You made a point that when that drug came out for melanoma, you had a 5% response rate, which is now 50%, but it was 20%. Then practice changed, it was 33%. And really, it's the last 3 years as we've learned how to use that drug correctly and how to implement dosing and how to manage patients that were over 50%. But it's been an evolution since 2015. Isn't it important that we're able to get these drugs in and learn and change clinical practice, sort of like an accelerated approval, similar to the APACE framework? Isn't that key? Because sometimes with these damn things, we just don't learn until we're doing.
I think it was Steve Jobs who said that anything makes sense in hindsight. So when you you look back, you can align the points and it looks nice and linear. The same is true for drug development. And one of the points is always that we say, but many of the new drugs aren't that great, and we have to find out. I'm very much on the side of those who don't have the luxury to wait. Because if you're dead, if everyone else is pleased with the level of evidence, which is just synonymous with price, let's face it, it is those people like my own community who are willing to take enormous risk because the other option is certain death. And of course, when you are faced with that kind of choice, I mean, it's nearly cynical to call it a choice, either certain death or taking a risk, most people will take that risk. Melanoma, we have a doubled age distribution. Many of our patients are young. When my husband was diagnosed, our daughters were 3 and 5. Many of them have children. Their purpose is seeing their children grow up. So these people are highly motivated and they will take risks. That doesn't mean that it is the right thing to do. And 5 years later, we might think differently about it. But you don't know it that at the time, and the patient does not have the time to wait. So we need something like a system that squares the circle, where we have fast access and reduce uncertainty for every decision maker as fast as possible. Also, as a patient, you don't want to have these uncertain drugs for decades to come. I mean, we had the right to try, right, in the US. It wasn't very popular. Theoretically, you could have access, but you don't want to have something where you really don't even think it's going to work. So I think it is balancing the two. Desperate people having access, but then having a system in place where we kind of make it easier to integrate into the system. That's why I think frameworks are a big helping point. I would push a bit further, as in I do think the member states have to get together, and I do want to see more like joint price negotiation, joint procurement. We've been able to do it for COVID, and I find there is no excuse why we can't do it for other situations. I know it's a little bit the sensitive topic, it's the holy cow. Times are changing, and I do believe it's like for us Europeans, if we do truly care about universal healthcare and our solidarity-based healthcare systems, we will have to rethink a few of those holy cows.
Kathleen, you as well were part of the expert committee of the APACE framework. You were representing Merck Sharp & Dohme, an industry player. Can you tell us how the framework should work from your perspective for oncology access? How do you see this improving access for patients as we're discussing?
As Martina mentioned, accelerated access has mostly been for regulatory pathways to date, and there is very little that gets past that is still accelerating, if you like. Once you get through regulatory, the speed element cuts out.
Yeah, it's what we always say, an accelerated approval to a lack of reimbursement.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that was part of the motivation for doing this project, because at the time you have regulatory approval, you don't have patient access, you don't have market access, but patient access ultimately is much more important. What we wanted to do was have all of the stakeholders in the room to make sure we had a framework that everyone could agree to take this forward, so that we have a pathway that continues the accelerated access, but for HTA or value assessment and pricing and reimbursement. Very often what we find is we can get a fast-track regulatory approval, but the time for that product to then get to market and to those patients who need it can be even longer, because for these small patient numbers, the time it takes to get the appropriate evidence for value assessment is much, much longer, and therefore the access overall is not accelerated. So it's how do we get to the point that we get it actually to the patients that need it, which, to be honest, is, well, it's why I get out of bed in the morning. I don't know anyone else that makes medicines to not get them to patients.
Well, we're hearing from a lot of the HTAs in particular that there's increasing pushback and questions regarding the accelerated approval. There's been several recommendations to actually get rid of the accelerated or conditional approval. Martina, from your perspective, how does the APACE framework address this issue, this sort of pushback we're getting on, no, accelerated approvals, we don't want them anymore?
We have seen many pushbacks. I mean, one of which, and then we could kind of experienced even during the panel, because some of the panelists didn't agree to just automatically say, okay, if a treatment got an accelerated approval at regulatory, automatically goes into an accelerated pathway through HTA. So that's already showing they want sort of an extra step to assess whether or not you should have an acceleration. The critical part is, as we were saying, it's obviously, first of all, the large uncertainty, which coupled with high price, and so that's something that many HTM payers are not comfortable with. For them, the trade-off of an early access with the limited evidence is not acceptable. Affordability in general, also the part on timelines, because we are talking about accelerating, but again, in many of our discussions, it was said, well, those are very complex diseases, those are very complex treatments, large uncertainties, we actually need more time almost. And that's what we are observing. So many HTA processes, lots of time is spent to discuss and understanding the key uncertainties and whether the treatment deserves to be reimbursed. So there's definitely quite a lot of pushback. And I mean, the way we're seeing this and we're trying to solve it is to introduce this initial assessment that maintain the methodological robustness that you observed, but also with the view of collecting more evidence and having an agreement between all the parties, because that's very important to then reassess this evidence that we don't see in many systems, and so understanding how that can take place is important.
This evidence continuum, Bettina, this is how you and I got to know each other, was working on the adaptive licensing project a dozen or so years ago.
Yes.
Doesn't APACE remind you of some of the discussions we had around adaptive licensing way back when in the last, close to the last millennium? Is this coming back, adaptive licensing? And I guess from your perspective, if it is, why was there so much pushback the first time?
There's even more story or background to that. So it's actually the way I came into adaptive licensing is that when my husband was diagnosed, we were a group of 5 European advanced melanoma patients, and we really hated the trials that were available at the time because they were randomizing against chemotherapy, which I learned the term nocebo back then, had no use but did damage. And we discussed among us what we would consider fair, and that was access while learning from it. And then, after everyone was dead, and I started the Melanoma Patient Network Europe and started organizing my first conference, I went back to that idea and started reading up on it. And I was gobsmacked that Hans-Georg Eichler had already published years earlier the concept of adaptive licensing. So this concept has been around now for 15, 20 years? Yeah. So it's nothing new. I do, however, believe an idea has to be there at the right time. I think it was too early, the pressure was not high enough, And how do we say nothing is as powerful as an idea whose time has come? Let's go back to the basics. I mean, people have been spending a lot of effort on this already. Newdigs, for example, as well in the US. I don't think we have to, pretend it's novel. We've been having this for a long time. But I do think then the time is right now, and it has never been more timely to go back to these issues. When we met to discuss for the framework, that was before most favored nation pricing. That was before the tariffs. So now looking back, you get a very different perspective on what the work we did back then and looking at the reality now. Countries are realizing that their health policies and their industrial policies don't align. I actually believe that a framework like that can help to realign industrial policies and healthcare policies.
One of the challenges from an industry perspective for certainly adaptive licensing, which I heard, is that it's very difficult to have an adaptive approach. Industry likes the clarity of a phase 1, a phase 2, a phase 3. They like the cash flow. They like the timing. They like that. I mean, you're working now taking front and center lead on the APACE framework, Kathleen. I mean, how is this from an industry perspective? Are you getting pushback from other industry partners, or have times changed?
First of all, this is a collaboration. This is not just something that MSD has done in isolation. So GSK and AZ are part of this, and it's important that it's a collaboration because we know we don't have all the answers. Equally, it's important that we have all the stakeholders in the room, like I said earlier, because we have to look at this from all sides. The discussions that we have had on access is always interpreted as very polarised, and we have one position that we go to payers with and they say, well, you're missing all of this evidence, so therefore we don't agree. And then you're trying to find the common ground in the middle. And the point of doing this was, can we set a framework that gives us common ground to start with, that we can then drive through? So we miss out some of the polarising discussions that you're overpricing, or all of these things are all in the mix. We are commercial organisations. We have to look at what is coming in the pipeline and how we fund that. As much as everyone agrees with the solidarity model, we can't do it for nothing. So what we need is something that gives us an assessment that recognises the value of the innovations that we are bringing to market, both now and in the future. This is a piece in the puzzle. We're not suggesting that this is a silver bullet that's going to fix everything. It's opened the discussion with the right people in the room, and it's given us a framework to go forward on and to build on. This, for us, I don't believe is the end game. I think it's a step on the ladder to get us to where we want to need, and to make sure that we continue the conversations with the right people.
Now, look, we know that EMA has generally been on board with this stuff. It's been the HTAs that are often the barrier. Are HTAs on board now? I mean, what is the situation?
They are definitely on board in terms of, or at least some of them, in terms of converging the methodologies. And again, I'm referring to the new HTA regulation, but even in that case we can see how long it took. We are talking, Greg,
and we've got a bit to go.
Yeah, and just because you're sitting in the same building doesn't mean you agree, right? I mean,
and that's only for a part of the overall value assessment, and so it took that long to get into the clinical effectiveness and the specific part of value assessment. But there is other aspects that needs to converge in a way, so that it's definitely something that is still missing. And again, that's what we are trying to do with the APACE framework, providing those principles in terms of the what is the evidence that is acceptable at initial assessment, close to regulatory approval, what is realistic to have at that point, and what should be required to have later on, which obviously requires industry investment for further evidence generation, which it's something that has to come from them as well. In reality, you'd need to collect and have different studies in different countries for that specific indication. And what we are trying to do is trying to centralize and plan in advance all of this evidence generation plan. And at the end, one element that we included is the pricing, which we know it's contentious aspect of it.
Yeah.
It's not just dynamic evidence generation, but it's also dynamic pricing, because in a way the price should reflect your value at every stage of your assessment. And that's where we didn't necessarily find an agreement or support from everyone, but that's ideally where we would like to get to.
Bettina, you're close to the HTAs generally, whether they want to be or not. You generally get in there. And from your perspective, are you seeing more willingness to move in this direction now, or is there more pushback? What's your feeling right now if we're trying to put in a more adaptive approach, given the fact that you're often interfacing with the HTAs?
We are living in a very different world today than we were maybe a decade ago. If we look back at UNETA and the discussions we've had back in those days, and you would thought, oh my God, this will never come together. I do think that sometimes pressure helps. So the moment we had a regulation in place, all the things that supposedly were never possible were all of a sudden possible, and in quite surprising timeframes. First, everyone complained, and then people were surprised. Now I've listened to some interesting discussions that I hadn't kind of expected. I was on a panel, or listened to a panel with Beate Wiesner from IQWiC, who basically showed the differences, the issue about the different comparators. And it's basically where inequity in access bites us twice. So first, patients don't have access to the same therapies, and then we have different comparators which undermine our joint efforts to get our act together European-wide. So I think it was quite stark when she showed that and reflected on how we're kind of punishing ourselves twice. And I think as Europeans that makes no sense. So as European Union, I think that's one of the points to take home. And then there is another point. I mean, in the end, HTAs are public bodies. They're financed by taxpayers' money. We have a policy process, and I think voters and patients are increasingly expecting answers, especially in a situation like this. So I do think that we will see more pragmatism just also by the outside pressure and more pulling together. And I do think that also, just like if you see how they interact with each other. I mean, when I started, it was HTA was my value system versus your value system, and then we could discuss that for hours. And now it's more about how can we support each other? How can we use AI to be faster? There's a session today about Central and Eastern Europe, so how can we collaborate better? So I think the focus and the approach has become already more pragmatic, more hands-on, more like wide-eyed, and also I think finally looking at the overall impact. If we look back to the original discussions why we got the EMA in the first place, was that because we had so many tiny regulatory units, Europe as a space was not attractive. The same is true for HTA, because we are so splitted, we hurt everyone. By everyone trying to optimize for themselves, we hurt all of us as a community. That is just not intelligent. So I do think it's really the moment is the stepping forward is now.
That's a really good point. I'd like to bring Kathleen on this too. You've both been in regulatory access in some capacity for quite a while now. Part of the problem before with accelerated approval was the regulatory legal structures. They weren't allowed to do it. That a lot of the member states just were not allowed. Have those barriers legally and regulatorily been alleviated? Are those barriers removed legally?
I don't think they're all removed, but I think they are improving. The EU HTA gives us some of that improvement. We've still got work to do around that, and I think we can do that collectively as a community, but we can also do that as individual companies. That, I think, is step one, because up until now, everyone's gone, well, I don't want to talk about it because I can't do this, and that actually doesn't change anything. We need to start saying, right, this is difficult because of X, Y, and Z. What do we do about X, Y, and Z? So EU HTA will help with that. I think the European Health Data Space also allows us access to data, in GDP aside, is a step forward in terms of the access we could have to these kind of data to validate what we're doing. We all come at this from different angles because we all have little pieces that we are looking at from the future. But the common thread through all of this is how do we make it better for the patient at the end of the day? And that is where we've got to bring our focus back to.
GDPR side, I actually have a different comment onto that. I think there's a black hole. And I mean, I had this, when I started advocacy, definitely had this naive assumption that regulations were covering and that someone certainly had thought about it. But what we have is we have a regulatory framework for market authorization, which is harmonized and all sorted out, and we have a clinical trial regulation. But then there is this gap of early access where every country does whatever they consider appropriate or have no provision at all. And I just first couldn't believe it. We've actually mapped access in MPNE to all the available drugs at the time and saw where kind of in the process they were stuck. And we could see this really, really clear, what we call the black hole, after the end of the last clinical trial and the full covering like reimbursement decision and utilization, where patients had no access. And it is crazy that there are no provisions. So I do believe that on my wish list for things for what Europe needs to sort out and harmonize is this early access process. Because in my other life at the Stockholm School of Economics Institute for Research, I work in precision medicine implementation, as you know very well, where we are trying to collect actually data on precision medicine, where we have precisely this problem of small patient numbers, and where we get stuck in this process of we figured out how to collect the data, so it's not as hopeless as you always make it seem to be.
How dare you?
But we are meeting these issues with early access that are from country to country so different and actually contradictory at times, and that always hurts patients. So on my wish list for Christmas is coming soon, is a piece of regulation we have to sort for Europe, and it has to be harmonized, otherwise we introduce more inequalities. And coupled with an evidence generation, and there was actually a session just prior to this recording on precisely this issue, because some countries have a different conceptual framework around early access, that I believe that is the key that will help us to move from in this early access scheme. The moment we have a harmonized regulation, we will be able to structure a pathway through it. And then linking this with a joint clinical assessment and the regulatory approval, I do think that will move the needle for patients in Europe.
We're dancing around the issue of data. And obviously, I think one of the key parts of the APACE framework is a data collection agreement. Now, this obviously has to be framed within the context of the General Data Protection Legislation, the GDPR, the regulation. What are the legal frameworks around data protection in the context of the APACE framework, Martina? I don't want to get too anodyne and in the weeds, but how are we and where are we at with this? Because this is going to be a real key part of this in order to get the validation you require.
We didn't really go into much depth of this sort of legal framework related to the data, to be honest.
So is it kind of just miracle happens here right now, or do we got more than that?
You know, the idea was not to solve the whole problems and the whole pictures, obviously.
Okay.
Can't fix everything at once.
Yeah, exactly.
So for us, because our starting point was a lot of focus around the value assessment and the pricing elements, we didn't, go into depth of these aspects with our panelists, and we didn't necessarily have experts.
But data validation is going to be key, right? We agree with that.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Bettina, please.
One can have very nice concepts and ideas, and one can complain forever about it being so difficult, or one can try to do something about it. That's why I'm quite excited about precision medicine and these projects I'm currently working on that are based on the DRIP-like clinical trials, that actually using something like a platform approach. So where you kind of agree as a group what type of data you're going to collect. You use your own system because that's cheap. You OMOP it, and then you have a way to analyze it jointly together. So I think we need some kind of conceptual thinking which leverages as much of what we already have in order to keep costs down, that we agree on pragmatic, so that we don't have for everything something else, so it becomes a little bit an off-the-shelf evidence capture system, if you like, and you may have to make it easy to slot any new product into. So I believe the future of this will not be one product at a time, but an overall kind of data capture system that works with clinical reality, that ideally has an incentive for everyone involved to contribute, like you have access for your patient on a drug. If you contribute the data, then you can also publish it, will help your career, so you need to make it work for everyone. So we have made progress with this. So I do think it is starting small, having a demonstrator, and then learn from it, and then becoming more sophisticated. I don't think we will ever have, and I don't think we actually should have this data lake where we put all our data just to create a new security concern.
But the European Commission is trying. They're trying to promote that.
But we can do this with a contractual agreement between the parties involved. We don't necessarily have to have a legal framework for everything. As with everything, you have to start somewhere. And as we said, this is a piece in the jigsaw that we're then building for. So we're starting somewhere, and taking Bettina's point, it's time to stop complaining about it and look at, right, well, what can we do?
And the upcoming joint action for precision medicine that has just started, the 1st of November, has actually demonstrators on that. And I actually think precision medicine is a helpful construct in that, because it is small patient population by design. So it will always be small, but once we have figured that out, I believe we can use the system for other things as well. So there are initiatives ongoing. We've always tried to boil the ocean. We try to solve everything for everyone, for all products, all the time. And that's not how you change complex complex adaptive systems. So you build one thing that you get to work, and I think once you have figured out how that, I think we will accelerate afterwards.
So speaking of that, we don't want to boil the ocean. Completely agree. Should the APACE framework be targeted specifically for certain high unmet medical need cancers? Should we look at oncology more broadly? What would you advocate to be the first rollouts and first targets?
Definitely, first of all, to deal with the concerns of HTA agencies, because otherwise they would see everything coming in that would go through an accelerated pathways, and that's why we discussed some of the criteria that would need to be in place. They should work at regulatory level, at HTA level, not being different, because that's what we're seeing, and that's where we see the difference even at the start on what is an unmet need. So we still don't have a shared definition of it, and that's why we built those criteria, which are largely debated in the literature, but there's not necessarily an agreement. So we are talking about major therapeutic gaps when it comes to lack of an effective treatment, or also lack of a satisfactory treatment, and that's when the nuance comes and where there are different views on what is treatment that is needed. Then the urgency of the treatment, which makes the acceleration so important, that, as Bettina was saying.
Yeah.
So it's the kind of impact on survival, but not just survival, because in some contexts it's also important the impact on quality of life, but also conditions that are reversible, and after you go and you reach a certain stage, it's more difficult to intervene and to treat. So the urgency is very important. And then the third criteria, where we spent a large amount of time to discuss, is the promise of effectiveness.
Yeah.
And that's the wording that we managed to agree on.
Sort of miracle happens here, I guess. Yeah, okay.
And that's where you see the different views, because what is the promising therapy?
Yeah.
So HTA will want to see a therapy that is addressing the unmet need.
HTAs want a free drug with 100% response. We know that. Okay. Yeah. So now between that and zero, there may be an area for agreement. Maybe.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Bettina, you wanted to jump in, please.
We should be pragmatic here, and we should start with something where everyone agrees it's worth the pain. So you want something that patients want, clinicians want to prescribe, regulators are on board, HTAs are willing to look at it, or the pressure is so high that we have to deal with it. So I think that's the first thing we should build, because otherwise we're going to have more of these what is unmet need and what is benefit discussions, and we can do this until we retire. So I do believe we need a coalition of the willing, a group of people who say, okay, that's a good product, we just start, and then we worry about all the rest. Because it will be extra effort. It will also be painful, because I think there will be new things will not work out the first time, so everyone will have to put more attention, more effort into it. I personally don't believe it will start with one of these wonder drugs, because their risk will be so high. Wonder drug, a company will expect to make a lot of return on investment. I don't think it will be the first to go into such a system. I think it will be something that is safe-ish enough, maybe some rare disease population, something like this. So I want to demonstrate. I'm more interested in building it. If you try to have everything at the first time, you will not succeed. This is about system change. You need to build something that proves it is possible, and then you can go to the more higher risk product. No one will put all their eggs in one basket and then wait for it to explode. That will never work.
Often it's only one egg.
Yeah, that's even worse. So just like, I think it's a poor approach. I do think the framework is correct, but just like to get it started, this is about system transformation, and one has to understand how systems change, and they don't change with the big splash. They change with a careful, small, well-designed experiment based on which we can then extrapolate and grow.
I'd like to come back to the question of unmet medical need, because there's been increasing desire in Europe to reframe unmet medical need in some criteria as yet undefined. Do we need a moving goalpost there? Are you comfortable with what you've got now as a drug developer? What's your opinion on this?
Unmet need has to meet the patient need, and it has to be broad enough to account for that.
If we had the opportunity to project a year out, and we're here with the APACE and it's rolled out, what are the next steps in the framework? It's
basically moving in the kind of at the both level, the top level and the bottom level. So at the top level, continue the dialogue in order to discuss and agree the principles, and moving towards more and more commitment. You need the regulation to really push the countries, but at the stage that we are, it's more dialogue and more agreements towards certain key principle, but also at the bottom seeing the adaptations in each country. So depending on where the country is, it can be about creating an accelerated pathways, or improving what they already have, or implementing something that they've been thinking about for many years.
Bettina, from your perspective, if we had the opportunity to roll this out 1 year from now, what are we looking at? What do we see?
I would like to see a concrete case where it has actually been used. So not just talked about, but actually applied. So, that's implementation is where good ideas go to die.
Yeah.
So it's time to really see it in real life. I also think we have to rediscuss it considering the overall political climate. And I'm personally I'm very interested right now in looking at the alignment with industrial policy, because I think that is where we are currently struggling.
Kathleen, finally,
Sure.
Last word to you. If you had the opportunity to be 1 year out with your crystal ball, what would you like to see with the APACE framework? Where are we?
I would like to have seen it implemented. I'd like to see some practical use of it so that we can look at what we need to learn from that, because I'm under no illusions that this is perfect as it currently is. It's a framework that we can start from. We're going to have challenges as we go through that process, but the only way we're going to improve it is if we actually try it and then see where the gaps are, what we should have thought about that we maybe didn't when we were sitting in the clinical room having the discussion. How do we make it work, and how do we make it better? We need to extend the discussion about what the evidence looks like and the gaps between regulatory evidence and value assessment evidence, and how we can look at that in other ways than we currently do. I think there also has to be an ongoing discussion about how we change the systems. We have systems for value assessment that haven't changed since the 1990s. And industry is still working to those systems as well. So on both sides of the table, we have to look at how do we evolve the systems that we engage with for value assessment to meet the new innovative medicines that are coming to market, but also how does industry look at how we change those submissions and how we collect the evidence and submit to it. And that's both sides of the coin. You can't do one of those in isolation. And I don't think we're going to get that done in a year. I ought to add in, but I would like to at least start the process.
We can be ambitious. So, achieving accelerated patient access to cancer care in Europe, APACE, old wine in new bottles. Alphonse Karr, the French philosopher, said the more things change, the more they stay the same. We have adaptive licensing is returned, and who knows, maybe it'll come back. Ladies, it's been wonderful speaking to you. Martina, it's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Bettina, always great to see you.
Likewise.
And Kathleen, always great to see you too.
Thank you so much.
Thank you
Duane.
very much for your time. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
This podcast was supported by Merck Sharp & Dahm as part of the APACE project in collaboration with GlaxoSmithKline and AstraZeneca. Video by Ben Harbour. Editing by Caden Drake. The Vital Health Podcast is a production of Vital Transformation, LLC, copyright 2025.